Our next speaker is a true expert when it comes to figuring out clinical puzzles. Dr. Richard Wright is our brilliant leader at Pacific Heart Institute. He is co-director of the California Medicare Contractor Advisory Committee, chair of the American College of Cardiology National Carrier Advisor Committee, and cardiology advisor for Medicare's Relative Value Update Committee. Dr. Wright normally travels the globe lecturing on all things cardiology, but this year his patients were fortunate to get to see him always in the same time zone. In an effort to understand how recent medication advances can help us live longer, Dr. Wright will be presenting on updates in pharmacotherapies in cardiovascular disease. Like earlier, we will have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of this discussion for a live question and answer round with Dr. Wright and Dr. Billingsley. So please make sure to submit your question throughout this presentation using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now here's Dr. Wright.
Well, thanks for the great introduction. Thank you for joining me as well. I'm going to give a talk today about the use of medications. And as the title says, this is really about the rediscovery of medicines that may have been around for a long time, but that we have new uses for. And please save your questions till the end. We'll have plenty of time to address whatever questions you may have. So the title of this talk is Repurposing Medicines 2021, as I mentioned. And I put in the little moniker there of something old, never new, always borrowed, and sometimes blue, because as I hope to convince you, one way that we can help patients live longer and live better is by appropriate use of medicines, some of which have been around a long, long time. These are my disclosures. Some of these companies make medicines which may be referred to in the talk today, although I will tell you that I don't have any conflicts with regard to any finances about these particular medications. So what do we mean when we say repurpose? As you can see, the dictionary definition here is to adopt something for use in a different purpose. Now, sometimes these Venn diagrams, if you will, overlap. That is, a use may have similar uses, but I'm going to talk about medicines that were originally developed for something entirely different than what they ended up being used for in the cardiovascular arena. And we're going to talk specifically about how pain relievers have been now utilized to prevent heart attacks, how medicines developed initially to treat the chest discomfort that accompanies narrowed arteries, we call that angina, can be used to prevent death in patients with heart failure. I'll talk about high blood pressure medicines, which have been repurposed to treat heart failure or to prevent its appearance. I'll talk about newer drugs that were developed initially as diabetes remedies, but which will turn out to be more useful for treating and preventing heart attacks, heart failure, and kidney failure. And finally, an old remedy for gout that has been repurposed to treat patients in hopes of preventing heart attacks. And I'd like to start just by going back to somebody who lived 150 years ago. This is von Ruckatonski. He is an Austrian, and he's the father of modern sort of anatomical forensic pathology. He himself did 70,000 autopsies. And as such, there are over a dozen anatomic features which are named after this particular gentleman. And despite being an august professor at a university, what he said was those about to study medicine and the younger physicians should light their torches at the fires of the ancients. As my mentor back in Boston said, you really need to apprentice yourself to very smart people so that you will get a good grounding. And that's what Baron Karl von Ruckatonski said 100 years ago. So let's go back in time, and I'm going to go way back. This is a depiction of an ancient Egyptian papyrus. This was compiled in about 1500 BC. We're not sure exactly. It's a very large document. It's 30 meters long. And what it is a compilation of 2,000 years of medicinal recipes dating back to the ancient pharaonic times, and including many things which are, believe it or not, still used today. There, in this document, there are surgical tips and wound tips and things, but there are almost 900 different pharmacologic recipes. And because they had a limited number of things from which to make these medicines, over 100 of these included castor oil, for example. Now, not everything in this document is applicable in modern times. And part of it, even though the document says that there are some medicines that can put the heart into working order, remember that in ancient times, they didn't know what the heart did, and they didn't know its function, partly because they were not allowed to do human anatomical dissections. And it wasn't until 3,000 years later that the function of the heart was discovered. But within this document, there's some very interesting things, obviously much of which can be ignored. Here's one in yellow: using excrement of the gods to treat tremors. I have no idea what excrement of the gods is, but the next line says human excrement mixed with yeast and honey is recommended to treat wounds. And if you keep reading, it says that male semen can be used for other purposes. But in this document, there's some surprising findings. Here's one. In the Ebers Papyrus, there's reference to using the bark of a willow tree to treat individuals with aches and pains. Now, this was 4,000 years ago, this was discovered. It was codified, however, by the father of modern medicine, Hippocrates, in ancient Greece. And he actually wrote that you could give willow leaf tea to women to ease the pain of childbirth. So here we are, over 2,400 years ago, when already there was a remedy for pain relief. That was the extract from the willow tree. Now, medicinally, fast forward 2,000 years, and finally, it was begun to the beginnings of understandings of how this worked. In fact, in 1763 in London, this particular vicar, actually, Edward Stone, described how you could use willow bark to treat various things. And about 50, 60 years later, in Germany, the active ingredient from these plants was discovered and named. And about 30 years later, 25 years later, the chemical structure was deduced. And notice in the line here in the middle, I say acetylsilic acid was produced. That was in 1853, but this particular French chemist didn't have the wisdom to patent that particular device. These medicines were used at that time to treat aches and pains and fever, as is listed here in 1876. But it was in the late 1800s that this was finally discovered as to exactly how this worked. And it was discovered in Germany. A chemist who worked for Bayer Pharmaceuticals found that if he took the active ingredient from the willow plant and other plants, and he added a chemical group to it, that you would reduce the irritant properties. If you use the medicine that comes from the willow plant, it irritated the stomach. So he had the ability to chemically play with the molecule, and he came up with this name, the compound acetylsalicylic acid, which within the next years was patented by Bayer and was named aspirin. And as listed here, aspirin was actually a combination of acetyl, which was the thing that was added to the salicin. Salicin comes from a bunch of plants, one of which is this genus, Spirea. That's where the spur comes from. And the IN was a common suffix used when naming medicines for the time. So aspirin was actually a branded trade name. It's not a generic, it's a branded trade name. And of course, many years ago, it lost its patent potential. Interestingly, the next year, Bayer was ready to shelf aspirin and not to use it, not to market it, because it didn't think it had marketing potential. But when you look at the documents in the German history there, the real reason was Bayer had also just invented heroin. And they said heroin was going to be a good cough suppressant and it was non-addictive, which shows you how scientists can sometimes be misled. Fortunately, others in Bayer decided that aspirin did have a future and brought it, as depicted on the right of the slide, to market for use for both its anti-fever use and to reduce pain and suffering. Now, here is the chemical structure for any chemists in the audience. Salicylic acid, which is the fundamental plant compound, and then acetylsalicylic acid on the right. And it's this acetyl group that is the key to the use of aspirin for heart disease prevention. Nobody knew how aspirin worked, even though it's been around in use for 4,000 years. It wasn't until 1971 that somebody actually was able to determine how it worked. And here's the gentleman who did it, John Vane. He's a British was a British pharmacologist who at the University of London figured out that aspirin worked by interfering with some natural substances called prostaglandins, and it prevented prostaglandin production And that's how it had an anti-inflammatory effect. So that anti-inflammation works for aches and pains like rheumatism, rheumatoid arthritis, etc. But it turns out it's not the anti-inflammatory effect that helps me as a cardiologist treat patients to prevent heart attacks. His work, by the way, won him the Nobel Prize in 1982. Aspirin, it turns out, prior to John Vane's discovery of how it worked, was already being utilized here in the greater Los Angeles area by what I call an unsung hero. This is a picture of him. We don't know a lot about him. He died more than 40 years ago. But this was a general practitioner in the LA suburb of Glendale, California. And he recommended, here's his actual recommendation that he published in 1948. He said he recommended an aspirin a day to reduce future heart attack. And the reason he deduced this was because he had had a lot of patients. And what he said is that he had noticed that his children that were given chewing gum that had aspirin in it, that's how babies were given, or kids were given aspirin at the time, that they seemed, if they were given aspirin after tonsillectomy, to have excess bleeding. And he had believed that heart attacks were due to thrombosis in the coronary arteries, at that time called coronary artery thrombosis. And so therefore, A leads to B and B to C, and he deduced that if aspirin caused bleeding in kids, that maybe it would prevent clots in adults, and he recommended in 1948 that this be undertaken. So here's his recipe, 1948, an aspirin a day for men between 45 and 65, particularly those who are now we know at risk, like overweight or sedentary. He made the same recommendation for his patients who'd recovered from heart attacks. And his advice, as I mentioned, was based on his overview of 8,000 patients that he had in his practice. And he reported this, unfortunately, and this is still pervasive today, that medical journals tend to ignore people in the community and instead to only publish articles from people who are at major universities. He was a general practitioner in Glendale, California, and his advice was summarily ignored, partly because who reads the Mississippi Valley Medical Journal? So even though some people read it, they said, oh, these are just observations. No one listened, including, by the way, President Eisenhower's physician, a very august cardiologist from Boston, who was the most famous cardiologist in America. In 1955, Ike had a heart attack and aspirin was not administered to Eisenhower. Instead, he was given the more potent anticoagulant warfarin, which we know is actually less useful than aspirin. It's too bad that Paul Dudley White, the cardiologist in 1955 for the president, didn't listen to Dr. Lawrence Craven's advice. And in 1957, Dr. Craven died, ironically, from an acute heart attack. So that was 1948. Let's fast forward to the first trial of aspirin. So there was this smoldering thinking, maybe aspirin would help people after heart attack. And in 1971, a study was embarked upon. It was published in 1974. So we're talking more than 25 years after Dr. Craven's advice. And on the right is the figure from that particular article showing that aspirin versus placebo did seem to have a benefit. However, if you look on the upper left of this slide, see how it says for debate? The problem with this trial was it was stopped prematurely. They didn't have enough people enrolled into the trial. They only looked at fatal heart attacks. They didn't look at people with subsequent heart attacks or the development of unstable symptoms of angina. And hence, statistically, this didn't quite reach statistical significance. And therefore, they said it's unproven. We don't think aspirin necessarily is helpful. Why was the study stopped early? Because an observation done by an epidemiologist said that if people were taking aspirin versus not taking aspirin, the ones who were not taking aspirin were more likely to survive their heart attack. But the reason was, in retrospect, is if you were taking aspirin, you weren't going to have the heart attack that was going to kill you in the first place. So they misinterpreted these epidemiologic data. And hence, this study in 1974 was not widely embraced, even though it was the first showing that aspirin made a difference. How does aspirin make a difference? Here is a depiction in this yellow color, the flesh color here, of a platelet, the cells that circulate in your bloodstream. And these are the first body's defense to form a clot. And aspirin works in this green area over here, inhibiting an enzyme called cyclooxygenase. If you inhibit that enzyme, you prevent a prostaglandin being produced, called thromboxane, And that substance amplifies the platelet's ability to clot together to form a little cork. If your artery has a rent in it, you don't want to bleed to death. These platelets plug up that hole in the artery, and they do so in part by this particular prostaglandin that is blocked by aspirin. This is a depiction of the enzyme. And it's interesting that other so-called non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, you may take naproxen, which is Aleve, or ibuprofen, which is Motrin, for example. And those things, it turns out, also block this, but in a different way. This is a cartoon of the cyclooxygenase. It's a dimer, two different proteins, and there's a site in there that makes this substance thromboxane. It turns out that that site is interfered with in the right panel here by all non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. However, unique to aspirin, this acetyl group, which, as I mentioned, back in Germany in the late 1800s, was added to salicylic acid. That acetyl group is donated and binds to the catalytic site inside this protein and hence permanently disables that enzyme. This is why if you take an aspirin, even at a low dose, all the platelets that are currently circulating at the time that you take a platelet are paralyzed by this acetylation. And that isn't true of ibuprofen or naproxen or Celebrex or any of the other non-steroidals. And this is why aspirin is unique amongst the non-steroidals at having a durable effect at preventing clots and heart attacks. So how does it prevent heart attacks? Well, here's a depiction of your artery, hopefully not your artery, but an artery of patients who will see their cardiologist. And starting perhaps as early as age 18, fat deposits of cholesterol and other substances build up. And then finally, a clot may develop. And that clot is what aspirin helps prevent. And of course, that clot is the cause of 95% of heart attacks and a cause of many strokes as well. So aspirin will produce a benefit, both in preventing heart attack and also in preventing strokes. So in 1974, we had the first publication, but it was dismissed because it was inconclusive. And it wasn't until many years later, here in 2009, that they put together all the aspirin studies up to that time and showed that all vascular events and heart attacks were indeed prevented. And the bottom line is that if you give an aspirin a day to appropriate people, you will lower heart attacks by about 20 to 25%. The number's right around 22%. A really good return on investment because aspirin is very cheap. Now, should we give it to healthy people? This has been, in fact, studied in very large trials, including 2 within the last year. Here's the most recent, just published in 2021, within the last 2 weeks. And it's studied by a Canadian epidemiologist who gave, in 5,700 individuals considered at risk. These are not healthy people. These are high blood pressure individuals, high cholesterol, diabetics, in their 60s, and you give them an aspirin or not, and you can see that over the next 5 or 6 years, aspirin does help prevent cardiovascular events compared to no aspirin. This is direct head-to-head in a blinded fashion. However, if you look at these data more closely, what you find is that it takes a lot of people to prevent one heart attack. You have to treat hundreds and hundreds of people to prevent one heart attack, stroke, or cardiovascular death. And remember that aspirin has one downside, and that is if you paralyze the platelets, some people will bleed. And the number who bleed is about 1 per 100. So if you have to treat 700 people to prevent a heart attack or stroke, but you cause 7 people to bleed, it's not clear that that's a good return on that aspirin investment. And that's why the current thinking is that healthy adults who do not have vascular disease do not benefit from an aspirin, at least from the heart perspective. So what can we summarize about willow bark? 4,000 years of use of willow bark and eventually aspirin. It lowers heart attacks and cardiovascular deaths, no question about that, but only in appropriate patients, not in normal, healthy people who do not have vascular disease. It's best to use non-coated aspirin because the enteric coated aspirin labeled as safety or coated does not get absorbed in up to 25% of people, and hence I only recommend non-coated chewable baby aspirin flavored like cherries or oranges, just like you took as a child. And for 95% of people, 81 milligrams, that's the typical American adult low dose aspirin. In Europe, it's 75 milligrams, but somewhere between 75 and 100 milligrams is all that is warranted and required by about by 95% of people. By the way, those of you who think there's resistance to aspirin, there's almost no such thing. If you give intravenous aspirin, it works in over 99% of people. Somebody who's so-called resistant to the effects of aspirin usually means they're not absorbing aspirin. And that's why we recommend giving the aspirin in the non-coated variety. Now, that was something old. I want to go to something borrowed. And this is borrowed from this snake, the Brazilian pit viper. 50 years ago, it was noted that farmers who are working in the field in Brazil, if they were bitten by the snake, would have a sudden and catastrophic reduction in their blood pressure. And from that observation, people said, well, maybe we can extract something from the viper's venom that might lower blood pressure. Maybe there's an antihypertensive agent in the Brazilian pit viper's venom. And the same guy that I just talked about, who won the Nobel Prize in 1982 for discovering aspirin, was the key person who said, let's explore this. And he introduced this, actually even before his aspirin work, to some colleagues to say, let's see if there's something in the Brazilian pit viper's venom that might lower blood pressure. He knew that there was an intrinsic hormonal system that regulates your blood pressure. This is what's going on right now in you to regulate, along with other systems, your blood pressure. It's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And in concert with the brain and the kidneys and other organs, the body makes hormones that either up the blood pressure or can lower blood pressure. Mostly it's upping the blood pressure, these hormones. It turns out that one of the enzymes here called angiotensin-converting enzyme is the rate-limiting step in producing these substances that elevate blood pressure. And in the Brazilian pit viper's venom, it turns out there was a substance that blocks that enzyme. So these chemists in England, working at the suggestion of John Vane, discovered substances. They went through over 2,000 different substances to find one that would modify the enzyme's activity and lower blood pressure effectively and not catastrophically, like happened with the Brazilian pit viper. And the first of these that was patented and came to market was called Captopril. Now, Captopril was put to the test, or rather the son of Captopril was put to the test in a very large blood pressure trial. So let me show you that, in fact, this does lower blood pressure. This is the largest blood pressure trial ever done. 42,000 people, 4 different drugs were pitted against each other to say, is there a difference between blood pressure medicines? The study is old. It's almost 20 years old now. We actually participated in this particular study here at Pacific Heart Institute. But here's the bottom line. Notice that there are 3 drugs on this slide. One of the drugs used, called doxazosin at the time, actually early in the study was found not to be as effective and more harmful, and it was dropped from the study. So that tells you right there that not all blood pressure reducing drugs are the same. Here is the blood pressure reduction. On the left is the most important marker, which is the systolic, the first of the 2 numbers when you have your blood pressure taken. And notice that the average blood pressure on enrollment in this trial was about 145, and it dropped to about 135. And that is typical. Most blood pressure drugs at this type of range of blood pressure lower blood pressure by 10 points. Notice that there was a difference even between these 3 drugs used at good doses. In green is the most common ACE inhibitor, son of Captopril, called lisinopril. Many of you may be on lisinopril. And it's an effective blood pressure reducing agent. Notice that it does promptly and effectively and safely reduce blood pressure, although surprisingly not quite as well as the red drug here, which is amlodipine, another commonly used drug, or this so-called thiazide type diuretic. In this case, a long-acting thiazide type called chlorthalidone. So for blood pressure reduction, there is a pecking order here, and it turns out chlorthalidone was actually better when given randomly to people than the ACE inhibitor lisinopril. But for the cumulative events in this trial, which was did somebody have a heart attack, didn't matter, right? The drugs didn't seem to differ, even though they were different for blood pressure, they didn't differ by heart attacks over the ensuing 5 years. Now, it turns out part of the reason for that is lowering blood pressure is not a very good way of preventing heart attacks. There are better ways to prevent heart attacks. I just showed you one, aspirin. The other one, of course, is statins to lower cholesterol. Blood pressure drugs in and of themselves are not very effective. There is a difference, however, for stroke. And again, here, lisinopril didn't quite do as well as either chlorthalidone in yellow or red amlodipine. And there are little nuances of which patients respond better, but you can see that there is a little bit of difference for stroke prevention with these particular drugs. And if you combine all events, they're pretty similar, although because this is a large trial, the victor here compared to lisinopril was the thiazide type diuretic. So these subtle distinctions you can discuss with your physician if you happen to be on treatment for high blood pressure. So ACE inhibitors were found right away to be useful for high blood pressure, but it turned out that wasn't their major niche. Their major niche was treating heart failure. So what is heart failure? Heart failure is a syndrome like fever, right? Fever isn't a disease. They used to think it was. It isn't. Heart failure means the heart is not working. It doesn't deliver adequate blood at an adequate pressure. Right? That's what heart failure is. When we think of heart failure, and the drugs that I'm going to discuss in the following minutes for heart failure is a specific variety of heart dysfunction that we call heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, or systolic heart failure, the common kind in the past of heart failure, which means the heart on the left here is stretched out. It becomes more spherical instead of oval in shape, and it's weak. So we express this by a number called ejection fraction, how much blood can be ejected per beat by the heart. Your heart hopefully is normal and is ejecting 60% or so of the blood contained within the heart chamber during each beat. But these people may have an ejection fraction of 40 or 30 or 20 or 10, where the heart is just not very strong and it cannot pump blood very effectively. That's where ACE inhibitors turned out to have an edge. Because when pitted against no ACE inhibitor, here's another son of captopril. Captopril works, but it was too short acting. So drugs like enalapril and lisinopril were developed that would last 12 to 24 hours. And if you pit those against placebo, and this is death on the vertical axis, that if you have somebody with reduced ejection fraction heart failure, they live longer if they're given enalapril or any of the ACE inhibitors compared to no ACE inhibitor. So that was a bingo moment. ACE inhibitors, yes, they lowered blood pressure, but they didn't seem to save lives differently than other drugs. But here we had, for the first time, a drug that could prolong life of people that had a weak heart and reduced ejection fraction heart failure. And in fact, over the following years, a bunch of studies were done with different ACE inhibitors. The vertical axis is the death reduction. And across the board, there was about a 20% reduction in death in people with reduced ejection fraction heart failure. So this was an enormous advance in treatment of heart failure, because up till that point, somebody with a weak heart, you could mollify their symptoms, but we had no known way of prolonging their life. Now, I must tell you that ACE inhibitors were terrific, but that was 25 years ago. They have subsequently been superseded by better agents. So if you come to see me for treatment of heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, I'm not going to put you on an ACE inhibitor anymore, because son of ACE inhibitor, here called sacubitril plus valsartan or Entresto, works better in a head-to-head analysis. And that's true whether you look at death or whether heart failure, hospitalizations, it's been superseded by better drugs. Nonetheless, ACE inhibitors were the first widely used therapy to prolong life in heart failure patients, and they've now been eclipsed. But this was a sentinel moment showing us that we could, in fact, help heart failure patients. And this came from observations of Brazilian farmers dying in the field of shock from a venom. But there are other ways to treat the failing heart. And again, this is a repurposing of a medicine. Here's another Nobel laureate, another Brit, James Black, who really was remarkably bright in thinking sort of what I call the Gretzky approach of where the puck is going to be. Sir James Black, he was later knighted, as you can see here, won the Nobel Prize in 1988. And the way he won the Nobel Prize was because he invented, and that's the right word, invented beta blockers. Unlike the medicines that I just told you about that exist in nature, beta blockers do not exist in nature. These are an invention of man. And this thought of his was stimulated by the unfortunate demise of his dad. He was in, Sir Black was in medical school, and his dad died of a heart attack, having had angina before. And at the time, it was felt that angina and heart attacks were in part precipitated by rapid heart beating. We know that the heart beats rapidly in response to norepinephrine, or otherwise called adrenaline. That's what they call it in Europe. And so he had this concept that if you could take adrenaline and modify it, maybe you could bind to wherever adrenaline binds. At that point, nobody had discovered these receptors where adrenaline binds. But he conceptualized there must be such receptors. He knew from a previous scientist named Alquist that receptors existed. Nobody had purified them. And he said, if we modify adrenaline, maybe we can make it like an umbrella and sit over the beta receptor on the cells and therefore prevent the cells from seeing adrenaline and hence slowing the heart. He wanted to stop the effects of the heart from adrenaline on the heart and therefore improve angina. That was his goal. This was, in fact, the first of the designer medicines that came to market. It was patented in 1962. It's still in use today. Propranolol, some of you may be on it. It's mainly used for tremor reduction now because it's a short-acting medicine and has again been supplanted by other beta blockers. Later, it was found to lower blood pressure. That's not why the medicines were developed. They were developed to reduce heart rate. Today, we use them all the time to reduce heart rate, to prevent tachycardia, which means fast heart rate. And they are also used as blood pressure agents, although they are not the best blood pressure agents on the market. But again, the thinking was not quite right when beta blockers first came out. And indeed, the medical thinking back in the 70s, after the initial introduction for the first few years of beta blockers, was that these drugs should be avoided in heart failure patients and in angina. In fact, here's a quote directly from a medical book in 1978. Because patients in heart failure are critically dependent on sympathetic activity of the heart to maintain cardiac output, you must avoid beta blockers in these patients. And that was 100% wrong. It was one of those things that we thought made sense, but turned out to be completely wrong. Now, I will tell you, there is still thinking. Last week, I went on Wikipedia and I downloaded this quote. This is from January of 2021. Beta blockers should not be used in those with an already slow heart rate and most of those with heart failure. Wrong, wrong, wrong. And here it is in what many of you do when you use Dr. Google as your advisor. Why were these smart people and even Wikipedia misled? The reason is because in red here is a normal heart, and green is a heart that has just been removed from somebody who underwent a heart transplant. Their heart was so weak they needed a heart transplant. And in red, what was known at the time back in the 70s, left to right is heart rate, and the vertical axis is the strength of the heart. In red, the normal heart, as it speeds up, it beats more strongly. This is why when you run or do any athletic activity, your heart is a better pump, in part because it beats better when it's faster. But it turns out the failing heart does not do this. The failing heart is exactly the opposite. The program, the genetic program of the failing heart has been altered such that it hibernates a little bit, and the heart, to protect itself, gets weaker with faster heartbeats. It doesn't get stronger. And hence the notion that if you slowed the heart in the normal person, you would indeed weaken the heart. But in the green column, the green graph here, notice that if you gave a slower heart rate to a failing heart patient, the heart will get stronger, paradoxic compared to normal physiology. And indeed, here are the data. The vertical axis is this number I introduced to you called ejection fraction. These people with heart failure had a low ejection fraction of 25%. When given the standard of care back in the day, their ejection fraction remained stable. But when given a beta blocker, metoprolol, one of the beta blockers, the ejection fraction rose. No modern medical therapy has exceeded this rise. The average rise in ejection fraction on appropriate beta blockers is 9 percentage points. That means these people went from 25 to 34. That is huge and not replicated by any medicine since then. But does that, in fact, that improvement save lives? Here are all of the large randomized beta blocker trials. And if you look on the right here, this is the death rate reduction over a brief period of time, 10 months, 12 months, 15 months. You reduce death rates by 35%. And that is just stunning. One other point. Within the normal range of heartbeats, the failing heart does much better if it goes slower. If you walked into a doctor's office with heart failure and your heart rate was 75 or 80 in green here versus 70 to 75 in this pink color versus 65 in yellow or 60 in orange or below 60 in purple, the vertical axis here is the heart failure outcome, death, heart failure hospital stay. And notice that people who have slower hearts do dramatically better. This isn't like a little incremental gain. We must, in heart failure patients with low ejection fraction, lower heart rate, to a greater degree than what most doctors are doing today. So the resting heart rate in such patients using beta blockers and other therapies should be down at 60. And I can tell you that that is achievable when using appropriate medication. Now, a couple others in closing. Diabetes treatment. Nobody can look at this. These are the current diabetes medicines. Are you kidding me? There are 11 classes. There are like 50 different drugs. It's unbelievable. All of these lower blood sugar, all of them. And that's why they were developed as diabetes drugs. But it turns out most of these drugs, in fact, 9 of the 11 classes of diabetes drugs, do nothing to prevent heart attack, stroke, kidney failure, death. Nothing. They lower blood sugar, but they don't lower these events. Why is that important? Because diabetics don't usually die of diabetes. What they die of is premature cardiovascular death. If you have diabetes, your life, if not appropriately treated, will be 7 years shorter than the other people in your community with similar age and demographics who don't have diabetes. So what can we do about that? Well, fortunately, new medicines have come to the rescue. Here's the latest. These are called SGLT2 inhibitors. Here in this cartoon in red is the blood vessel that goes, these small blood vessels that go to your kidney. Now, as you know, the kidney is an organ which is supposed to filter noxious substances out of the blood. But the filter is permeable, and in green are sugar molecules, glucose, that are circulating in the blood, but they make it through the sieve of the blood vessel and make it into the beginnings of urine. This isn't actually what's secreted into your bladder, but this is the beginnings of urine. And prior to elimination from the kidney into the bladder, the kidney has the opportunity to suck this sugar back up into the bloodstream. And it does so through a protein channel called the SGLT2 channel. This SGLT2 protein is very effective at sucking up all the sugar that would otherwise be eliminated into your urine. And that was important in a time when we didn't have access to calories, right? I mean, if you were living in the plains of Botswana trying to feed yourself, it's important not to lose calories. If you block this protein, however, the sugar that is filtered doesn't have the opportunity to get reabsorbed, and it's eliminated in the urine. Well, that lowers sugar, no question about it. You can eliminate a lot of sugar. But because there was concern, the diabetes drugs were killing people, the government mandated that so-called outcomes trials be done. Give diabetics the medicine. Do they do better than those who are not given the medicine, or did they do worse? Are there more heart attacks? Are there more deaths? And surprisingly, when these SGLT2 inhibitors were tried, here's one, canagliflozin, here's another, dapagliflozin, here's another, empagliflozin, and there are others. To the left of this line of unity means that the drugs save lives. To the right, they don't save lives. And the remarkable thing is that for the first time, in fact, these were so stunning, people didn't believe the original trials. No, diabetes drugs can't possibly save lives in 18 months or whatever. But they did, repeatedly, over and over. And in fact, if you look at cardiovascular events, again, here's the line of unity. If you look to the left, means that there are fewer events. To the right, there are more events. And whether you look at this dot, which is cardiovascular death, as well as heart failure hospital stays, if you look at heart failure, being admitted to the hospital, if you look at kidney outcomes, if you look at death, all-cause death, every single one of these was in favor of people being treated with this class of drugs. Now, I will tell you, insulin doesn't do this. Metformin doesn't do this. Most of the other drugs that are used for diabetes don't do this. This was a sentinel observation. Unbelievable. In this particular analysis here, 38,000 patients are in this particular analysis. So hugely beneficial, particularly in heart failure. Now here is a stunning observation. In those trials, some non-diabetics got into a trial of diabetics. And it looks like that the people who were given in blue versus not given in red, this particular class of drugs did better even if they didn't have diabetes. This is a diabetes drug being used in non-diabetics. In fact, my prediction is that these drugs will become standard of care. As of January 1st of 2021, across all 51 hospitals in the Providence system, we are now encouraging and measuring the use of these drugs in people with reduced ejection fraction heart failure. And more recently, it's been shown that it prevents kidney dysfunction. So this was true even in non-diabetics. How could that be? Well, it turns out that if you're diabetic and have high sugar, lots of sugar appears in the urine. And so it's felt that some of the benefits, certainly for lowering sugar, is because you excrete lots of glucose into the urine. But in non-diabetics, they don't have a lot of sugar appearing in their urine. And in fact, this drug does not does not increase the amount of sugar being excreted in the urine in non-diabetics. So it works in some other way. We don't know for sure what way. But just in the last week, what they've shown, here's the most important, on the left here in the middle, left ventricular ejection fraction given to people who do not have diabetes, do not have high blood sugar. And if you give them an SGLT2 inhibitor, their ejection fraction goes up 6 percentage points. I already told you that beta blockers increase the ejection fraction 9 points. ACE inhibitors, the old ACE inhibitors, only increased it 2 points. Here's a class of drugs that increases at 6 points, even in non-diabetics. And if you look at these other ones, these people feel better, they walk better, their hearts get smaller, and this all occurs in the first week or two after starting this drug. So these drugs are miraculous in ways that we do not yet understand at helping patients. So my prediction is they'll be used widely, even in non-diabetics. And it turns out there's a glucose transport in the gut. And just in recent weeks, it's been shown that if you block that and increase glucose secretion into the gut, that you also will have some benefits. So we're awaiting further data about the so-called SGLT1, which is the gut glucose receptor. Lastly, gout. Hopefully none of you have had a right foot that looks like this. This poor individual, left foot is normal. Here in the toe joints here are crystals of uric acid deposited. These are like miniature daggers, and they are very, very sharp and very pro-inflammatory. And if they deposit in your joints, you get this horrible pain and inflammation, which we know of as gout. Gout was known about 4,000 years ago. The Ebers Papyrus says, if you have rheumatism and swelling, like I just showed you, use this plant, the autumn crocus, Colchicine autumnale. So this was widely accepted thousands of years ago by all these august physicians across the world, in Greece, in Persia, in France, in England. It was even used for edema in London in the 1700s, and we may get to that here in a minute. And in fact, it was introduced into America by Benjamin Franklin, who had gout. But the active ingredient of that was not well known. But in 1800, somebody discovered that in this plant, been around thousands of years, that there was a substance that this person named colchicine. Right? And the first trial of this, even though it had been used for 4,000 years, was in 1961. This shows you how sometimes people accept stuff and it hasn't been, in fact, proven in a scientific manner. This first trial was not randomized. The first randomized trial was in 1987 in New Zealand. Unbelievable. It's also used for as many of you who are plant advocates know, in horticulture for other reasons. So here's the observation, though, that led to how this drug has become widely used. Patients with gout have more heart attacks, as do all people with arthritis for the most part. And in fact, it was found that if a gout patient was on colchicine, they had a lower incidence of heart attack and stroke, but only when they were taking their colchicine. It wasn't that they had elected to take colchicine, it was the act of taking colchicine that lowered their risk of heart attack or stroke. Now, this is observational, it's very suggestive, but it had to be put to the test. And it was first put to the test and published in 2019, that if you took somebody with a heart attack and treated them with the normal stuff, if you've had a heart attack, you know that you're gonna get a statin and an aspirin, and maybe you have a stent with another platelet drug, et cetera, et cetera. On top of that, if you gave colchicine, there were fewer heart attacks. So for the first time, it was shown that this drug, which was developed for gout and arthralgias, was useful to prevent heart attacks. And just in recent months, a very important study saying, what about people who haven't had a heart attack but are at risk of heart attack? Do they benefit from colchicine? And the answer is convincingly yes. Blue is no colchicine with normal therapy. Red is colchicine plus normal therapies. This is a study of 5,500 people. And look at this so-called hazard ratio. The people given colchicine had a 31% reduction in the likelihood of dying or having a myocardial infarction or stroke or needing an angioplasty or bypass surgery. So huge, huge data. How does this work? These are cells. In red is the architectural tubules, we call them, in the cells. And it turns out inflammatory cells need these tubules to do their work. Colchicine interferes with these microtubules, and the inflammatory cells can't do their job. So anti-inflammatory medicines finally are now shown to have an effect. They finally arrived. This has been a concept for a long time, but they finally arrived to prevent cardiovascular events with an old drug from 4,000 years ago called colchicine. We're not quite sure of the exact drug, the exact dose, the timing. Do people need to be on this forever? It's so new. We just don't have these data for heart patients. But certainly for gout patients on colchicine, the current advice is don't go off it because it'll help prevent heart attacks. So let me, in closing, just say that many patients are, in my view, being inadequately treated. We have terrific medications. These medications make an enormous difference, as I hope I've convinced you, but they're being widely underutilized, partly because patients say they don't want to take medicines, right? They would prefer a natural approach. Well, you can chew on willow bark, and I guess you can use other natural approaches like these plants, but why not avail yourself of modern science and use something that has actually been purified? If you do, treating cardiovascular disease, I don't consider to be rocket science. It isn't rocket science. It's actually much harder than rocket science. Rocket science is pure and simple math. You plug it into a computer, and that isn't how people work. But with appropriate aggressive medications and close follow-up and attention to detail for every person as an individual, from a cardiovascular perspective, many lives can be saved. And I thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful understanding of what the pharmaceutical realm is doing to help us stay forever young. We received lots of questions. I'll start with a question for Dr. Wright about the SGLT2 inhibitors for non-diabetics. Are you routinely prescribing them, and is insurance covering it?
Two separate questions. So the good news is you heard about the FDA. The FDA has approved one of the, there are many now, there are half a dozen SGLT2 inhibitors, but one of them is now approved for use in heart failure. So yes, I am in reduced ejection fraction heart failure, the people with low ejection fractions. It is now considered cornerstone of therapy. It's one of the 4 drugs we try to get everybody on. Drug companies are supporting further research in this, but yes, they are being paid for even in non-diabetics, and anybody with low ejection fraction heart failure should talk to their docs about going on to an SGLT2 inhibitor.
And a similar follow-up question, are you prescribing colchicine for patients without gout, and which dose are you starting on?
So these studies literally have just come out in the last 4 weeks, some of them. And I think the answer should be yes. One of the problems with colchicine is a cost procurement. So you've been in practice long enough that you know that a few years ago, colchicine was pennies per pill. And because of an oddity of the FDA and an oddity that colchicine had been around so long that nobody had done a clinical trial and actually gotten FDA approval, it is now considered a non-generic medicine, even though it's been generic for decades. And hence the procurement cost, instead of pennies per pill, is many dollars per pill. And that's an impediment when you're putting people on medicines for the rest of their lives. And I believe that patent covers colchicine for another 4 years or so. So we're in a little bit of a pickle, but I think in a perfect world, would I recommend everybody be on colchicine if they have documented coronary disease? I would. Whether everybody with high risk, don't know. You heard Dr. Weinberg talked about calcium in the coronary arteries. I think people with coronary artery calcification, we should significantly increase our use of colchicine in such people.
Great, thank you. And then a couple of questions for Dr. Billingsley. One is it better to always request brand name only medication? Should I assume it's the best option? And then kind of similar to that, how safe are drugs from overseas? And should I assume my brand name medication is made in the United States?
So those are both great questions. So I would say no, you don't necessarily always need to request the brand medication. As I've covered, the generic medications are modeled after the brand, so they should work the same way and get the same benefit as the brand medication. Now that said, it's no secret that the prescription drug pricing in the US is not very transparent. Medications tend to be more expensive. Insurance plans also have their own formularies where they prefer certain drugs over the other, and generally the generic is the preferred medication. So prescribers may default to those generic alternatives just because they tend to be preferred. It's less of a back and forth and hassle, with the insurance company. They should work the same, provide the same benefit, as well as be more affordable for patients. So now that said, as far as if drugs coming in from other countries are safe, as I've covered, a large percentage of our finished drug products and raw ingredients are coming from other countries, and these facilities are required to comply with the same standards as the facilities in the US. But as we've noticed, there are some challenges in monitoring compliance from these facilities. And so particularly with the inspections, the FDA has worked to fill in a lot of these gaps, including working more closely with their offices within those countries. And also keep in mind is that when these issues like the nitrosamine issue that has come up and being investigated by the FDA, other countries are also importing these drugs or having these drugs manufactured in places like China and India, or where some of these issues are coming from. And so other regulatory agencies are also involved and working with the FDA to make sure that a lot of these issues are being addressed. Now that said, I don't know if it's safe to, or you could, confidently assume that your medication is, necessarily made within the US every time.
Got it. And do you know if pharmacies have a responsibility to notify patients and or prescribers about recalls, or do patients need to be researching this on their own?
So I think from a legal perspective, I don't believe pharmacies have a legal responsibility to notify prescribers or patients of a recall. That may also depend on your state regulations, and so there may be a requirement with that regard. But you could make an argument that there is a professional or ethical reason to notify your patients or prescribers if any medications that were dispensed by your pharmacy was potentially impacted by these recalls. And so I think, bottom line, I think, consumers really need to, be vigilant, as are prescribers and pharmacies, to make sure that these recalls are addressed appropriately. Removing some of these products from the shelves, having tracking mechanisms in place to capture the lot number and manufacturer being dispensed to patients. And that way you have a better idea of who's actually being impacted and communicate that more specifically.
Great. And there's a fun question here for Dr. Wright. I know you were the cardiologist to the great apes at the LA Zoo. As a tangent, can you make any comments about the use of these drugs in gorillas, or conversely, have doctors learned anything from the use of meds on apes?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. Yes, I did for a decade do the cardiology for the orangutans, gorillas, and chimps at the zoo. And the reason that they need a cardiologist at the zoo is because these close relatives of ours suffer from the same problems that we as adults suffer for Homo sapien disease. So they get coronary disease, they have heart attacks, they have atrial fibrillation, they get heart failure. I have, in fact, I'm one of the few people in the world ever to have done CPR on a gorilla. That was a gorilla that had ventricular fibrillation while I was doing a transesophageal echocardiogram on the gorilla. So have they been treated with the drugs we talked about? Yes. And the problem is, it's hard to get these, from your own dog. How hard is it to get your dog to take a pill? It's not that easy. And gorillas and chimps are smart enough that you give them these pills, they pick them out of their food and throw them out. So it's been a challenge to get them to take their medicines. But we fully expect, and in fact, there's a gorilla that had a stent. I know of a gorilla that has a defibrillator in place because of cardiomyopathy. So the same treatments we use are used in these close relatives, I believe, with success. So what lessons have we learned? We all get the same diseases, even though, and for those of you who think that you can avoid heart disease by being a vegetarian, let me tell you, these animals eat the best diet you've ever seen. It's all fruits and leaves and vegetables, and they still get this disease. So you can't totally prevent it with diet alone.
Right. So Dr. Wright talked about aspirin. Another question for Dr. Billingsley: how safe are over-the-counter medications and supplements like your aspirin or other supplements? Is there any sort of regulation in the US for those products?
So there are, some regulations with that regard. It's a little more loose than with the prescription drug, approval processes. And then you get into the over-the-counter supplements that are regulated by a different act altogether. And a lot of the onus is on those facilities manufacturing those products to ensure their safety and their labeling and all of that as well.
Okay, and then we had multiple questions about the chewable aspirin. I think the biggest question was, if I have history of gastritis or ulcers or bleeding risks, am I okay taking a coated aspirin?
So let me give you my 1-minute elevator speech about this. A total myth. People think that aspirin irritates the stomach. It does not. The way that aspirin causes bleeding is a systemic effect. So I'll give you the perfect example. If you squirt aspirin into a vein, intravenous, which they have in Europe, we don't have it in America, the same percentage of gastric upset occurs as people taking oral aspirin. It's the systemic effect of aspirin. It's not the stomach effect of aspirin. So hence, aspirin works systemically. That's how it prevents heart attacks, but it also does cause gastric upset in 1 or 2% of people. The reason you don't want to take coated aspirin is, I'll give you the perfect experiment. I'll give you aspirin that I coat in stainless steel, and you'll tell me it was perfectly tolerable. I didn't have any upset stomach, except it'll be perfectly inadequate. It doesn't get absorbed and it doesn't work. So non-coated aspirin, when pitted against, for example, IV aspirin, has the same stomach problem. 1 or 2% of people get gastritis. In those people, you have to use some other agent. There are other antiplatelet minor blood thinners like clopidogrel that don't share that stomach upset problem. So it's not due to the coating. The coating only prevents stomach acid by preventing absorption.
We have a couple more minutes, or maybe one more question here. Dr. Billingsley, when do you expect the COVID vaccine to be FDA approved, or what steps will be required for that to happen?
So I think we could potentially expect to have, at least one approved probably this year. So whenever these companies, go through the emergency use authorization process, the FDA actually does have guidance for whenever you're approaching vaccines, some of the testing and the treatments. And so with regards to the vaccine, there's generally like a 2-month follow-up period before they can file a request. So looking at the AstraZeneca vaccine, for example, I believe the second doses were administered towards the end of January. And so generally there's like a 2-month waiting period as far as when most of the events would happen. And so at that point, probably towards the end of March, we'd have AstraZeneca applying for an emergency use authorization. And these companies can decide to continue on with their phase 3 clinical trials so that they can apply for licensing. And so rather than actually going through the new drug application with vaccines, they are considered biologics. And they file what's called a biologics license application, or BLA.
Great. And we have 1 more minute. Dr. Wright, if you can answer quickly, if people are on SGLT2 inhibitors, can they consume as much sugar as they like, or is there harm of having increased glucose in your urine?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there are lots of issues with too much sugar, one of being is your waistline. So no, I mean, we don't want people to embark on eating more carbohydrates You will eliminate more glucose. It's correct. You're going to eliminate 300 grams. Remember, one of the advantages of the SGLT2 inhibitor class, it's one of the few diabetes drugs that lowers weight, because if you waste calories every day in your urine as a diabetic, you will lose weight. So that is a big benefit for obese diabetics. But please don't then get free license to go out and go to Krispy Kreme every day.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Billingsley, Dr. Wright. That was great.